Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in the 7th episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will examine the strengths and weaknesses of democracy around the world. And in particular, Paul and I will consider the causes of democratic backsliding and also test whether moves away from high democratic ideals actually gaining popular support as well. But first, Paul will give us some context to take us through the democratic backsliding, define what it means, identify what countries are decisively eroding democratic principles that were once embraced by both power elites and citizenry alike. The questions today are going to include: are we seeing more democratic backsliding in recent times? Is it just a political phenomenon, or does it extend beyond the political sphere? Where has democratic backsliding been in evidence? And what do Chile, Guatemala, Israel, and Thailand have in common when it comes to backsliding? And what is occurring in the United States? If a democracy backslides, what does it slide into? Okay, so with all that said and done, you know what the program's about today. Before we cross to Paul, here's an invitation to those of you who are with us live as we record this podcast. Now, feel free to interact with us while we are live via YouTube. We prefer YouTube because it syncs in really well. But also you can on Facebook. And also remember that your comments and or questions and your interaction in general may be included in this broadcast. So let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who's waiting online, and we're going to dig down deep into this issue of democratic backsliding. Let's cross to Paul. Paul, good afternoon. Kia ora koutou iho. How are you?
I'm very good, Selwyn. Kia ora to you. Good afternoon to the audience. Great to be back. Yeah, this is an interesting subject. Shall I explain the backdrop to this, how we came up with this idea?
Definitely go for the context, Paul, and let's introduce the people to the concepts, and then we'll dig down deep.
Okay. So over the weekend, I was reading about various elections where the popular will of the people has been stymied by various actors. And that includes Thailand, that includes, we're going to mention Israel, that includes Guatemala, and then with a slight twist, Chile as well. And I'm looking at them, and I started thinking about something that's very common, or has been for the last decade in the political science literature, specifically the literature on democracy and comparative politics. And that is this notion of democratic backsliding. And I thought to myself, what I'm watching is clearly an example of backsliding, but backsliding, to me, appears to be more than just, messing with the electoral system. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought I got to bring this up to Selwyn, because actually I'm seeing evidence of societal backsliding. We're just not as open-minded and liberal as we used to be. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it would be a good show. So we've agreed on this, and I thought I'd start with defining the concept. Again, I'm a former academic, so I got to be a bit pedantic, but it goes like this. A democratic backslide or a democratic decline, there's many ways to phrase it, is it started out when a mature liberal democracy starts moving to something less liberal. In fact, Fakeed Zakaria of CNN fame now coined the phrase illiberal democracy, where the protections and the rights of minorities and others were rolled back, and then others picked up on this and said yes. And when you have this sort of backsliding, you slide back into what are known as illiberal, hard, or guarded democracies. That is, they're not liberal anymore, and they're not social democracies either, because the slide can occur in places like Sweden, which it has, that used to be, very egalitarian on a number of levels, and now they're not so much, better than many other places, to be sure. So the slide is away from true liberalism and towards something else that has, quite frankly, a more authoritarian tone to it. It's subtle, but it's not, but it's evident, right? So, for example, in the electoral sphere, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen the following. The outright winners of the Thai elections, the Move Forward Party and its coalition partners, they won the popular vote handily. But the outgoing military-backed regime has stacked the deck in the Senate so that there are military appointees in the Thai Senate. And what they did was they would not ratify the lower house confirmation that the Move Forward Party and its leader, his short name is PITA, could form a government. And that's because PITA had campaigned on reducing the military presence in Thai life and reducing the powers of the monarchy. And that right there, the military and the monarchy were like, oh no, you're not doing that. But in this day and age, they no longer resort to coups. Not in Thailand, not in Chile, coups are uncool. I guess except if you're a Wagner wannabe. So what do?
It's a different type of cool, isn't
it? Right. Not a push. But so what they do is they stack the Senate, the upper house, with retired military people who are monarchists and what have you. And what happened is apparently the Move Forward Party and its coalition partners needed 570 something votes to form a government, and they only got 531. They fell short by 51 votes. And the military has made clear that they don't want this fellow PITA. They've tried to disqualify him by saying that as the owner of an entertainment television company, he has a conflict of interest. Well, he gave up his shares in that company before he ran, for parliament. And so they're trying to, use the law, but, bending the law to get rid of this guy because they want a more centrist party to lead the government, and one that will not mess with military privileges and the monarchy. All right, so they're playing the legal game, and they're going to win. They will win legally. However, Thais, again, this coalition won handily. I think it was 56% of the vote in a system that had like 20 parties running. That's a very healthy percentage. People are already hitting the streets in Thailand. So this could turn ugly in a hurry, but it's an example where rather than allow the popular will to prevail, as you would in a liberal democracy, and just grin and bear it until the next electoral cycle, these conservatives have decided, no, we can't live with this guy and his coalition. We want a safe government. And that's evidence of a move towards a guarded democracy. But the interests that are being guarded are those of the conservative elites. That's what this is about. And so we'll see how it plays out. Meanwhile, the same thing's happening in Guatemala. The fellow who won the most votes in the Guatemalan elections didn't get 50%. So there's now a runoff. But what happens? He's a progressive. He's for in Guatemalan society. Plus, I believe he's half indigenous. So, he's got Mayan blood in him and everything. Well, Guatemalan elites are not big about allowing indigenous folk to rule the show. So what do? In the buildup to the runoff, the electoral court, again, created by a former military regime as it was leaving the scene, decides that this guy is corrupt. Now, I don't know. That's like, pot calling the kettle black. I mean, corruption in Guatemala. But the electoral court disqualified him because of his apparent corruption. So now you've got to go with the second and the third vote getters in the general election in order to do the runoff. Well, guess what? They represent different sections of the Guatemalan elite. So once again, they have thwarted the popular will. This guy, again, he didn't make 50%, but he had 47. The others were in the 30s. And they rubbed him out. It wasn't a coup. There was no assassination. But they've basically now charged him with trumped up corruption charges. Now, Thailand is an immature democracy that ebbs and flows between military interventions. Guatemala is a very immature and fragile democracy. So you might say to yourself, well, it happens in these sort of places. But that brings me to Israel. And you know very well that I am loath to talk about Israel on this show because it always turns into a polemic and whatnot. But here's my interest in Israel. The hard fact of the matter is that Benjamin Netanyahu and his increasingly extremist right-wing coalition are now trying to reform the Constitution, such as it is in Israel. It's another place with an unwritten constitution, but change the laws to reduce the amount of judicial oversight over parliamentary activities. Well, that does two things. It, first of all, allows Netanyahu to try to escape the fraud and corruption charges that he's being brought to trial on. All of this trial has been postponed because of all the back and forth over these so-called constitutional reforms. But he wants to remove judicial independence and oversight so that he can ram through a right-wing agenda, even though, and here's where my interest lies, it turns out the polling shows that the majority of indigenous-born Jews, so Jews born in Israel, particularly those under 40, are leaning to the left. They want more progressive politics. They want an accommodation with the Palestinians. They want an end to the settlement program. I mean, these people are acting progressive, and those are the people who, for the last 9 weeks, have been demonstrating in the streets against these proposed reforms. And we're talking
on that point, Paul, we're witnessing this generational shift in different incarnations, if you like, around the world. Like you and I in previous episodes have identified, along with other political scientists, that this is their specialist area, where there's a generational shift relating to attitudes, values, etc., within the Russian Federation. And that same demographic that you're identifying there, non-gender specific, but age specific, 40, 45, down to 35. Really, those are the ones that are coming into becoming the power elites in the country, or a percentage of them. And you get a sense, don't you, that some of the what we're seeing in countries like Israel, certainly in the Russian Federation, they're aware of a generational shift that's coming like a tide, and they're doing everything to stop that. Now, I know you told me before the program of how the state of Israel is addressing this and stacking the deck in the current power elite's favor. I'll just put it back to you on that.
Yeah. Thanks for doing that. So so indigenous Jews are increasingly leaning left, and we have to be very clear. A lot of these people are tired of the constant struggle with the Palestinians. They don't want to rehash history, relitigate the whole thing. They want a settlement. They want an accommodation, and they're anti the expansion of settlements because that just prolongs the agony. So Netanyahu's got a problem because society is shifting underneath him. So what has Israel been doing for the last 10 years or so under consecutive conservative governments, by and large led by Netanyahu, is they're importing thousands of migrants, Orthodox Jewish migrants from Russia and the United States. Now, these people are radicals, okay? These are not into compromise. They want to wipe out the Palestinians. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. But they're now the base for Netanyahu's right-wing coalition. And I guess the question is, can you import that many people in order to stave off, if you will, the natural born drift to the left? Or are we just going to see, not only more conflict, but some sort of genocidal weirdness if these people continue to be preferentially let in? That's something I cannot answer. But in terms of the backsliding, and again, setting aside its unhappy history with the Palestinians, Israel at one point, at least for the Jews, was a fairly liberal democracy. In fact, it was a social democracy. The mindset in the 50s was the kibbutzim and whatnot would have a more social democratic aspect to it, even though it excluded Palestinians from full rights. So yeah, there's a lot of weirdness in that, but that is no longer what Israel looks like. Israel now has drifted hard to the right, even though in the popular will, the drift is to the left. So Israel's backsliding, and I think that's evident to everybody. I mean, you look at Israel the last 20 years, it's gotten, it's gotten very authoritarian, to be frank. And then there's the issue of Chile. Chile, yes, it's had its democratic transition. It now has a socialist president in the form of Gabriel Boric. But here's where the backsliding seems interesting, and this is I'm doing this to segue into the institutional and societal aspects of this. You may recall that after Boric was elected, they proposed a constitutional reform, and they created a constituent Congress or a constitutional Congress with 150 representatives from every community in Chile, but very, very much represented by indigenous people and by women and by queer folk. They all got massive representation in this very egalitarian constitutional Congress. And they came out with reforms that were very progressive, including limited autonomy in the judicial sphere and in the electoral sphere for indigenous communities such as the Mapuche in the Deep South, reparations for indigenous communities that had their land stolen by things like logging companies. And I hate to say it, but New Zealand logging companies benefited from the illegal confiscation of forestry lands in the years prior to their arrival in Chile, Fletcher's being the foremost amongst them. So this gave all these marginalized people a whole bunch of rights. Well, what happens? They put subject to a popular vote. It's rejected. And there were organized lobbying campaigns by elites and mining companies and all that. But the point is, it was rejected by Chilean citizens. And it was like 60-40. It wasn't even close. And I saw that. And now they're doing another one with a very watered down new constitution because they're trying to get away from the Pinochet era constitution, which is still the one that Chile operates under. I mean, it's an authoritarian constitution. But no, they couldn't, and that got me thinking, is it possible that for many people, there can be a situation where there are too many rights granted to too many people, that everything's fine as white males run the show. But
Is
as
that
soon as you
incongruous to what you're identifying with the generational shifts and the liberal left ideals that are being expressed within there? So, how does that reconcile itself?
Well, that's a very good point. In Chile, the youth are more left leaning, but in the opposition to the constitutional reforms, a lot of lobby groups got involved. And their argument wasn't like, oh no, we're going to have to pay reparations for land that we stole from these people 150 years ago. Their arguments is you're giving them too many rights. What do you mean the indigenous folk can have their own courts? What do you mean that they can hold elections, sort of like the Maori seats, that sort of
We've
thing.
seen evidence of this kind of mood within countries, the Anglophile countries, even the United States, obviously, as a cultural exporter. We've seen evidence of this type of thing too. Countries like where we're broadcasting from at the moment, New Zealand, it's evidence, with Hobson's Choice and others, those that are objecting to co-governance ideals and principles, goes on. Over in Australia, one gets a sense that it's got its constituency of reactionary parts and within the populations, but with the current government, things have just settled a little bit from the point of view of institution, which brings me to this point that we raised by way of question at the beginning, Paul. This political phenomenon that you've identified here, does it extend beyond the political sphere into institutional? And because I suspect I know the answer, because you've identified institutional expressions of it already in what you're describing here. Can you speak to those points? And sorry to have jumped in on this. I just
No,
wanted to
no,
show
no.
that there are parallels in this paradox, if you like. Is it paradox? Well, the conflict of trying to define something that excludes the other doesn't work in this day and age, meaning that we see generational shifts, but we also see huge popular support for other things that would include bigotry and things that are contrary to human rights principles, which we often kind of label under a left banner. But things are not as simple as that these days, are they?
No, they're not. And, I enjoy when you interject because, you're thinking differently than I do. So that it forces me to think, that's an interesting angle there. Well, this is what I would say shortly. Yeah, the backsliding is institutional as well. And remember, we at one point in the mid 20th century, democratic theorists were saying, well, the two maximum expressions of democracy are liberal democracy, capitalist societies, and social democracy. So, sort of state capitalist or socialist economy societies with democratic governance. And, the Nordic tier is the latter, and, the UK, the US were considered, epitomes of the former. Well, the notion back then was that then you would deepen those democracies downwards into society so that transparent and fair elections would turn into transparent and fair institutions, which in turn would generate democratic values in society, values of compromise, tolerance, the extension of rights, economic guarantees, welfare, so on and so forth. That's not what happened. There's been a steady erosion, if you will, but backsliding into harder type of approaches to democratic governments, and we see it in institutions. Now, I'm going to do a high and low thing again, macro micro thing. Let's think of it this way, and that includes us in New Zealand. I'll give you a case in point. Our listeners abroad will not know this, but think of it this way. We had a celebrated case, still ongoing, of an individual who I happen to have overlapped with in my surf life-saving years, who was the president of a political party, which is now doing very well in the polls and may be decisive in our October national elections. This individual is going to go on trial for historic sex offenses. It turns out he was a predator in the surf life-saving clubs that he frequented, and then this guy became a very big figure in surf life-saving New Zealand. And under New Zealand law, unlike, let's say, U.S. law, you can have name suppression, not only throughout the trial, but even if you're convicted, if revealing your name can hurt the victim. So it's usually done with instances of sexual offenses. You don't want to re-victimize the people who have suffered the offense in the first place. Well, very recently, a judge just came out because there's media interest in exposing this person. I mean, it's discussed regularly in social media who this person is. A judge came out and said that she was going to allow continuous name suppression for this individual because it might impact the election. It's like, hold on a second. This is a criminal matter. Why are you bringing politics? And why is it that you think it might impact this one party's electoral chances? And but it is what it is. I mean, we're going to get name suppression, but not because of what he did, but because it might negatively impact on a right-wing party that makes you wonder. Well, maybe the judge is a little leans to the right. The
I'll just
issue.
add in there the word alleged, just because the case is
Okay.
pending. Back to you.
Yeah. No. Anyway, the name suppression thing. If you're there to protect the victims, that's fine. Once you start saying you're going to protect a political party from the adverse consequences of having this individual was the president of this party. I personally think voters should know the type of individuals get to positions of prominence in this party because his offending, well, it's been well known in my former surf lifesaving community for years, right? And I've been out of that community for 15
No,
years.
I'll just once again add the word alleged.
The alleged events. Uh, so, the fact is, we've now got a judge interfering in the political system without rebuke. I mean, the Crown has not gone back and gone to the Supreme Court, Superior Court, whatever it's called, in order to appeal this decision. They're just letting it go. And that got me thinking about this phrase, weaponization of institutions. And the irony is that, particularly in the US, those who bark the most about the Justice Department getting weaponized and Congress getting weaponized and all that are those who do it, who actually use the institutions of democratic governance for partisan purposes,
So
for
let's
power.
discuss that at the moment, because my
Sure.
understanding is there's a major movement in the United States wrapped and directed by the Republican Party on exactly that point. If that is correct, Paul, can you speak to that point?
Yeah, I mean, the United States is the worst case example, but it occurs elsewhere. People have learned, there's learning curves around the world of, well, Trump got away with this. I mean, think of
Mm.
Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Yeah. I
He's
always think
been.
of it as the United States as this huge kind of entity which exports so many great things in culture like music, the arts, etc. But it also exports cultural things like this too, and that's
Yes,
why I raised
yeah,
it.
for better or for worse, the United States is an export machine, culturally and otherwise. Well, so the Republicans have decided, again, they've got some demographic problems themselves. And so, I've thought about it, read enough about it, and it seems that what they're doing is the core of the core. Okay, so the core of MAGA, uh, the moneyed core, I guess I would say, is conservative Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals. But they're a distinct minority. I mean, as in down below 10% of the US population. But they have a lot of money, and their Christianity is, how can I put it, outweighed by their racism and their reactionary view of the world. They don't want the extension of rights to transgender people. They think African Americans have too much rights. They even talk about rolling back the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I mean, these people are quite reactionary, and Trump is attuned to them. See, that's part of the problem is, they've got the ear of the wrong person. And so the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, especially as they're seeing that Trump may again be the front runner, have created a plan to roll back most of the progressive legislation of the last 50 years, including the Civil Rights Act. They're like, it's not necessary. There's no racism anymore in the States. This is just, woke people complaining incessantly. And that's where I get back again to this thought. And again, if our audience has an interest in this, is it possible in a former liberal democracy for there to be too many rights granted to too many people? Now, I don't think so, but I'm a sort of former lefty social democrat, democratic socialist. So, of course, I would think that. But, I wonder, is it possible in a heterogeneous society like the United States or the UK, or for that matter, Australia, because we see these arguments about, Aboriginal First Nation folk, giving them rights and reparations, the conservative
Look, it's
side
an
of the.
interesting concept because I suppose most of the people that watch this program, they know where you and I sit on such things. And I agree
Mm,
with you. My answer instinctively and also in the core of my DNA and values based would say, no, absolutely. This is all how progressive society should, embark on this journey. Then again, there are those within, let's say, around the world, there are different expressions of politics, and one of them is identity politics. And there are some that would argue that the more extreme identity politics elements of politics, where it perhaps is candidate selections, where there's a differential that is placed, where those of minority groups are elevated up so that they get a better shot than perhaps those that have enjoyed power elitism in the past. That does that lean toward an erosion of meritocracy if you look at it from a science point of view of population percentages and people within the society as a whole? So does that mean that politics, from the point of view of meritocracy, is actually elevated only when the majority that subscribe to a particular identity are looked after? So there's all sorts of traps and things like that. And I guess this is where the discourse in politics and policy relating to candidate selection, I'm thinking in New Zealand too here,
mm,
is an important part of the equation. So it's not just about, here are the candidates, let's vote for the ones we feel more, beneficial toward, or will benefit society, or whatever way you evaluate your equation and political persuasions. But there's a lot more to all of these types of things. And I think maybe that when we see commitment by perhaps executive government, where there may be addressing the wrongs of the past and elevating up sectors of our society that have been marginalised, that we get a pushback from those that have expressed and enjoyed and accepted the ideals of privilege in the past. And that's what we're seeing. So, Paul, I just wanted to add that kind of thing in because it doesn't, people like us are not excluded from some of the contrary views here, in the sense that should, for example, identity politics be embraced in a sense so that the smallest minority can have an elevated and projected voice on any particular area well beyond perhaps where the status quo would have been 10 years ago. So like in New Zealand, just to put it in simple
mm,
terms, and then I'll back out of this part, there was a mantra that came out, this is prior to the Jacinda Ardern government winning the Treasury benches and becoming executive government in 2017. There was a thing with white, pale, stale male, because obviously political elitism was wrapped around that stereotype. But there was derogatory kind of elements from right at the top of government and parties expressed within government addressing people in that way that basically shut down political public debate from people within that sector. Is that right? Is that good to do that and perhaps elevate others that have been held back but are a smaller minority for all that time? Hopefully I've made those points clear, because it's a delicate one, and obviously there's sensitivities wrapped around that, and rightfully so. Yeah. So
so throw it on
I
me.
think people, yeah, throw it back to you on that, because I guess because you raised it, So there you go. Let's tidy it up.
Yeah, I think I can tidy it up a little bit, but first I've got to do a bit of a mea culpa. As you know, but some of the listeners may not know, I don't have an evolutionary view of human history. I have a dialectical view dating back to my Marxist training and all of that sort of thing. But I have a major contradiction, because I subscribe to the idea that both social democracy and liberal democracy were probably the highest expressions of the capitalist and socialist forms of democracy. And then you worked evolutionarily, okay, so progressively, to deepen the roots of democracy well down into society and the economy. But in doing so, I've abandoned my dialectical approach. And that's a fundamental contradiction, because if I had remained dialectical with my deepening thesis, then I would have seen the backsliding coming, because, it's thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis that is, not either or, it's something new. And yet I didn't see it coming. So that's my mea culpa. But with regards to the emergence of identity politics and those things, I think we have to think of two different things. The granting of rights, the extension of rights, does not necessarily have to translate into party candidate selections. You mentioned the word meritocracy. And I would say that for parties who would put unqualified people into their apparatus, especially as candidates, and just because they fulfill a quota and whatnot, that is very likely to backfire, but that's on them. It's not about the rights granted to people. The granting of rights doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to start taking over anywhere. Now, rights include redress. I happen to believe in redressing historical wrongs. I happen to believe in reparations. I just happen to, have that opinion. But that doesn't translate to the tactical level. And I think what's happened with a lot of the identity politics folk is that they're confusing tactics with strategy. That the strategy is to extend rights to people and empower them in equal measure to the traditionally dominant groups in society. Give it a go. The tactics are to get more representation in parliament and that sort of thing. Where the rubber meets the road is that you can empower historically marginalized and oppressed people without some form of state intervention, right? It's not, the private sector and others. I mean, there may be very good charities and maybe very good businesses, but the fact is we got to bring the state back in. And that has to be a matter where that's decided is at the electoral level. Here we have labor, which represents extending rights and empowering people with, certain programs dedicated to alleviate, for example, youth poverty, the food and school programs, those sort of things. And then there's a right wing that says, no, they've got to lift themselves up by the bootstraps, and that's the way it is, and we don't care about structural inequalities. We don't. And you put that to the vote, and you see what the population thinks. Is it, do they subscribe to trickle down theory and the one percenters, or do they actually think that, yes, we have to do some forms of redress and redistribution?
So it comes down to small government, those big arguments of the 80s and 90s. It comes down to small government or interventionism, roll up the sleeves, let's get this thing done.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, here in New Zealand, we're not as afraid of the word socialism, and the Americans have
Yeah.
lost the plot. But we do see echoes of it here, where state intervention is called Stalinist. And we saw that with the vaccination campaigns and the lockdowns. That was a
Yeah.
public health issue.
Even yeah, even going back to Helen Clark's time as Prime Minister, the right were pushing around referring to it as Helengrad. And things
Yeah.
like that. I know I'd be on radio and I'd be speaking particular things. How I saw things and evaluate and analyze things. My opponent, who used to be the leader of the ACT Party, a far right party here in New Zealand, or I should say economic liberal, with fairness to Rodney Hyde, in different times he'd say, "Oh, Selwyn, you and your Soviet mates." I'd say there are, and I'd say, well, you're living in the past there, Rodney. Things have moved on a long way in the decades. But, this is the thing. It comes up. There are stereotypes to play within the discourse and live radio or wherever it may be. This is, I guess, what you're talking about here too, isn't it?
Yeah. And
Element of it.
it actually gives us an opportunity to segue into the societal discussion because,
Mm.
I mean, when not so much your interlocutor, Rodney, but when the right says that state intervention in a liberal democratic society, because we're liberal democratic, we're not social democratic here in New Zealand, but when they say that, it betrays two things: a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental ignorance. I mean, if you're calling Jacinda Ardern or Helen Clark a socialist when New Zealand is, the paragon of neoliberal economics under successive governments of different ideological persuasions, you're being dishonest or you're a dope. Okay, I mean but it works, and that's where I get to the societal level because at the end of the day, and I remember this, again, I come from a Latin American background. There was a famous political science who, writing about Brazil, said something to the effect is if you truly want to be democratic, if you truly love democracy, you have to love uncertainty. And it was all about the uncertainty of elections. And, that the thing that we fear the most is not what we know, it's what we don't know. I used to say this to my daughter when I was open water swimming. She wanted to do that, but she had a fear of sharks. And I said, yeah, the issue is this. If I knew sharks were here, we wouldn't swim. If I know absolutely that they're not here, then I'd happily swim. But I don't know that. We're getting in the water and there might be some big toothy fish about. I said, I think the odds are good for us, but I'll make sure that I swim faster than you. and, just to make fun of it. But there's another side to this. Okay. And we won't belabor the whole uncertainty issue. You can either, if you look at yourself in your heart of hearts, you can either like democracy as the highest political form for its intrinsic worth. It gives an equal voice to everyone, right? It grants universal human rights. See, the big thing is, democracies are about rights as well as responsibilities, and that seems to have been lost in recent years. The responsibility side, both collective and individual, right? We've got collective rights, such as labor rights, and then we have our individual liberties. Well, we can look at democracy for its intrinsic worth, and that, rest assured, that's how I look at it. I'm willing to suffer under right-wing governments because I believe that this is the best political form. However, this is where it gets scary at a societal level. In the past 5 or 6 years, international surveys, including the Pew Research Organization surveys, have shown that only about, on average, 50% of the electorate in democracies, both mature and immature, think democracy is the preferred political form. They're willing to think about other types of regime, so long as it does things for them, and that includes the youth. Okay, it's universally distributed, not just the old folk, but young people are increasingly jaded. Now, I would think several things about this. The first, of course, is democracy has become decadent and it is in decay in some places, corruption, venality, this whole populist weirdness. And so I can see people, starting to sour on the deal, particularly when they don't deliver material prosperity. At the end of the day, people, want to be comfortable, want to feel that their children will have better lives. And it's repeatedly been shown that this generation will not have better material lives than the boomers, people of my generation. And that leaves them disgruntled. Well, what happens? Democracy starts being looked at in an instrumental way, not as an intrinsic good, but now what can you do for me? And in the measure that it doesn't deliver to your particular preferences, you could be an oil worker in Oklahoma, you could be, a Wall Streeter, a sheep farmer in Australia. If you're not getting satisfaction from democracy, see, you're confusing the government of the day with, the regime. Then you start thinking of alternatives. And that's where it gets scary, because the 50% who don't see democracy as the preferred political form actually see various types of authoritarianism. They don't care about representation. They don't care about equal rights. They want delivery. This is the old, Mussolini made the trains run on time type of logic. And that's now very prevalent throughout the democratic world. It's led to the rise of, at best, hard democracies like those in Hungary, Turkey, and Poland. Where these are not liberal places anymore. But after the Cold War, both Hungary and Poland were relatively liberal, and Turkey, of course, before the emergence of Erdogan, was probably, arguably, the most liberal Muslim state in the entire world. And secular.
Secularism was something that they celebrated. Yeah.
And so, again, I'm thinking this, as we were thinking about this program, and I think, wow, the backsliding is political. We see it in this election weirdness. The backslide is institutional, and we see the corruption of institutions, the weaponization of institutions, and the erosion, in some cases, of the separation between the three branches of government via legal manipulation. But what about society? What about, societal democracy, where values, again, of toleration, compassion, empathy, collective solidarity, all those sort of things.
Because this speaks to that question that we put at the front end, doesn't it, Paul? If a democracy backslides, what does it slide into? That question.
Well,
so, this is what you're addressing basically here, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to argue is democratic backsliding is not just about, manipulating the electoral system. It's actually democracy, if you will, as an organic form. See, democracy is not just about governance. Okay. It's about how we treat each other on the streets. Okay. This idea that everybody has to have a fair go. I mean, who thought this up? Here's an analogy, a story. Well, I was living in Rio on a research fellowship in 1987. And my daughter Alejandra at that point was 5 years old. And we enrolled her at the British School of Rio de Janeiro, which happened to share a wall with the research center that I was affiliated with. So it was very convenient to take the bus. I'd drop her off at school, and then I'd literally walk around the corner and go to my office. Well, in between the bus stop and the door of the school or my office, we would every day would have to step around street beggars begging for small change. And this included children. It included people with very unpleasant illnesses. It's misery. This is why Brazil's got a third world status. And we were told by Brazilians, don't give them any money because that just encourages them. And so one day we were going back. We had a routine after school where we would go to what they call a vitamina bar, which is basically a juice bar. And she and I would have our little, frothy juice drinks while we waited for the bus. And as we were sitting there, we were looking at a mother and two kids in miserable condition on cardboard, just one laying on cardboard. And Ale turned to me and she said, "Papa, what did these people do that God punishes them so much?" And I was like, God has nothing to do with this. Okay. This is not God's work here. This is human work. They should not be in this situation. And, she took that on board. I hope that she still remembers that story now that she has her own children and is grown up. But here's where I'm going with this. Those Brazilian people who said, don't give them money, and only encourages them, they view them like rats. And let's fast forward to now and look at how people in a lot of democracies look at their fellow citizens and, God forbid, non-citizens. That idea of collective solidarity, we're all human at the end of the day, blah, blah, blah. I don't know, mate. I see a regression on the societal front. Now, some of that may be the hyper-individualism promoted by neoliberal ideologies. Some of it may be increasing economic precariousness, scarcity. The job market is now, full of part-time people. It's not like the old days where you work for the same firm for an entire lifetime. I mean, there's many, many factors. And all of this retrogression, I would say, is fueled by social media. Now, every reactionary and wannabe authoritarian can do a podcast. I mean, can get on a platform and start spouting the most inane things. And this came home.
So it comes up to like misinformation, disinformation, and compelling a society to react in a particular way. And, the word of our time, manipulation. And it's
right,
a difficult challenge.
But it also is premised on the idea, the fundamentally wrong idea, that the extension of rights or even compassion to other people somehow takes away your rights, right? Yeah. That if you're empathetic to someone else's plight, you're weak, all right? They wouldn't do the same for you. I mean, those attitudes, because they're ideological in origin, I see now more pervasively. And because I'm trying to explain to our audience how, I was thinking about this over the last week or so. My political science professor wife has a school teacher mother. And I hadn't paid much to this story, but it turns out we've got some very influential misogynist guys. Jordan Peterson, the sort of failed academic, psychology prof, and then the rapist dude, Andrew Tate, who have their podcasts and whatnot, and they are thoroughly misogynist, woman hating, and they're into this idea that they're alpha males, and alpha males, they dominate women in particular. Women are inferior. You don't take any guff from any woman. No. I mean, they're blatant retrogression, and it reminded me. So my mother-in-law is telling my wife about, we got some problems in our classrooms because we have teenage boys who are listening to these guys. And then they come into class where there are female teachers in class and they're going, I'm the alpha male around here. I'm not listening to what you have to say. And I remember saying to my wife, wow, that reminds me when I was living in Arizona out in the wilderness. I didn't associate with them, but I was well aware of this hunter community that said, oh, humans are on the top of the food chain because we're carnivores. We're not sheep. We're not cows. And we're the alphas in the forest because we eat meat. Heck, we even eat other predators. So, of course, humans are at the top of the food chain. And I think, if people like Peterson and Tate believe that they can take these crude biological analogies out of nature and apply them to human societies, uh, they're obviously screwed in the head. But the worst part is they are influential, very influential, in ways that you and I are not, Selwyn, quite frankly. And I use this just as an example of what I think is this backsliding at a societal level. I mean, I've asked people in my wider circles, do you think we should extend rights across the board? And I would think, because I circulate in a liberal to leftist crowd, that the answer would be unanimous. Of course, it's a universal good, right? Bring more people into the tent. That's not what happened, even in good old New Zealand, which is a little more progressive than some other places. And I think this is the fundamental problem of democratic backsliding. It's not confined to the electoral sphere. It's not just a matter of institutional decay or weaponization. It is a societal malaise. People are turning away from those values of toleration and whatnot
And
and
it can come out
adopting.
like you've identified it there and from very interesting quarters. And I'll give an example here. The Green Party in New Zealand, like many of its expressions of that kind of politics around the world, has highlighted and made extreme efforts to try and identify and elevate human rights principles, etc., all of this type of thing. Now, and going back a decade or so, there was a big push by the Green Party to lift party vote in New Zealand in the South Auckland electorates, a place where traditionally people have been marginalised. I actually grew up there myself, and so got some sort of awareness of how the us and them type of structure of New Zealand society and economic opportunity was manifest. And there was a discussion that happened with a person who was a very senior delegate that within the Green Party structure is very influential on who gets to represent the party at political or electoral level. They did poorly in their efforts to actually lift the party vote in the South Auckland electorates, and I made mention of this, and we were having a discussion as to why. And when challenged, the answer from this person, from a party that, like I say, had identified and lifted to extreme efforts to itself the principles of human rights, and the response was, well, they had their opportunity, but they got what they deserve. So just putting back to you, Paul, even in the most principled areas of New Zealand discourse, country, I suppose, from overseas, looks like it's got a few things going for it, is an extreme response that you don't expect coming from people that perhaps should know better.
I mean, I guess, there I think, well, if you go to South Auckland, which is, heavily Polynesian part of the Auckland community, you got to deal with religion, right? You can't come in as a secularist or an atheist and tell these people that they're worshiping fairies and that sort of thing. You've got to be tactically savvy, careful about that. And I think sometimes I would have a hard time dealing with religious people because I do think they believe in fairies. And so I can't take them seriously when they start talking about faith-based things. And so I wouldn't be a good tactician for any political party in a community such as that. But I think it goes more to this fundamental issue. If you look at all of the other organizations in society other than political society, so you look at the nuclear family, you look at how businesses are organized and structured, you look at sports teams, social clubs and everything, they are hierarchically organized. They are, in a word, authoritarian in their structure. And that includes, unions. I've written a lot about unions. There's always that, agent principal problem. Robert Michel's wrote in the 30s that the duty of the organization is to itself, then to its members. This is, again, well known in sociology. But if we look at all the other organizations in democratic society, they're all authoritarian at their core. And so it may be much for us to expect, A, that we can reconcile the contradiction between democratic governance based on equality for all and all these other layers of society which are inherently authoritarianism. And then, worse yet, I guess, we should not expect that just because we have democratic governance at the top and maybe institutional democracy in the forms of, fair and transparent courts for all and that sort of thing, that somehow this would be a trickle down into society that at its core is based, rooted in, and premised on authoritarian perspectives on how the world should be organized, including the nuclear family. So, of course, if, I used to crack a joke at university and say, Jerry Falwell, that Christian fundamentalist, he and I agree, absolutely. There is an attack on the nuclear family. The trouble is, we disagree on whether it's good or bad. I think it's a good idea. He thinks it sucks. And, the idea is if you start saying that women can marry women and, all that stuff, well, those who have, intensely patriarchal views of how the nuclear family should, that's an existential threat. See, that's the trouble. You and I may go, come on, I don't see any harm in dudes marrying dudes and, any of that stuff. But if you truly believe this, like Christian conservatives do, this is it. I mean, this is now the straw that's broken the camel's back. You're now attacking the, the absolute roots of society. And I think that's where we are. I think that we've reached the point, and it's fueled again by social media and by opportunistic politicians who start talking about traditional values and all that sort of thing, where the backsliding is now in the fabric of society. That there are people who think democracy does not have intrinsic worth, far from it, and it's no longer instrumentally delivering the goods, so it needs to be replaced by something else. Maybe that's an illiberal democracy. Maybe it's a guarded democracy. Heck, there's even a literature on militarized democracies. And, again, that now we're getting off into some serious, logical contradictions when we talk about militarized democracies. But the point is, it's not liberal or social democratic in nature. And then, of course, if you continue that backsliding trend, now you're sliding into authoritarianism. Right now, it's nothing democratic anymore. And I think we're right in the middle there. I think where I see, when I was alerted to this misogynist weirdness of these two guys, but, again, taking crude sort of Darwinism. I mean, Jordan Peterson apparently writes about lobsters and goes, the alpha male lobster has the biggest claw. And so alpha male humans got to have, who knows what they need to have. But, when you're using those analogies to talk about the complexities of human society in democratically framed places, you're nuts. Okay. You've blown any extension of the concept, to smithereens. And so I think there has to be in most of our democracies a discussion, and again, I like to see public debates, discussions, and even referendum about, not only where we want to be now, but where we want our children to be. And for me, it's a real immediate thing because my son, Enda, has dual citizenship. And right now, and for the foreseeable future, I want him to be in New Zealand, not the United States. He's got passports for both. And my American friends are, they're appalled. Even my lefty friends are like, what? You would choose this small island state for your boy over the United States? And I'm like, hell yeah. Take a look at yourselves. Do I want my precious child to be raised in this environment? Because it's not just about guns, although there's that too, but avarice, meanness. It's something's gone dark in
Yeah.
that place.
I mean, in some ways, the jaundiced approach to the principle of libertarianism and fairness. And I
Very good
think
point.
that's something that, in two words, kind of shows perhaps a profound difference. And obviously by way of birth and my accent, people can identify where I'm anchored in the will.
Mhm.
And I kind of think, well, good on you. I understand where you're coming from. I have travelled extensively myself and observed, although not lived in the United States. But so, Paul, let's wrap this up. And as we do, what I'll do, I've just selected 5 comments that came in while we've been recording this podcast live, and then back to you to wrap it up with uh, you know, whichever anywhere you wish, because you very much have driven this discussion, of which Barbara Thomas has rightfully put in the comments here. This is quite a profound discussion dealing with where basically Western society is going. So I'll just touch on what has come through over the course of the podcast's recording. Christian W., he says, the only country that has had a peaceful time since we came out of the Middle Ages is Switzerland. And guess what? They're not a republic. They are a direct democracy. And then Simon Hughes, he adds in here amongst the countries that we were discussing his concerns that South Africa is another concerning country about democratic backsliding. And Barbara Thomas, she has added when we were discussing the issues relating to what is missing in our societies, or perhaps has been washed over by more jaundiced attitudes. And she says, we probably need religion again of some sort. And she says, something that teaches basic morality and ethics, fundamental ethical behaviour. So you can see where she's coming from there.
Mm-hmm.
Simon Hughes says again, he says, from my understanding, this is when I was talking about the Green Party and, the principles of identity politics, and also some of the pushback relating to some of their own stated human rights ideals. And Simon Hughes says, from my understanding, the Green Party have a more stronger upper middle class support base. So, there's elements to discuss there too. And Barbara Thomas, once again, finishing off the comments that came through that I have selected here, and what I alluded to earlier, Barbara Thomas says, this is quite a profound discussion dealing with where basically Western society is going. And I agree with her 100% on that, Paul. So back to you to wrap it up. Let's see where we go with this.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, when I was discussing why I failed to mention, India is another example of backsliding. It's turning into a Hindu ethno state thanks to Prime Minister Modi's rather unpleasant policies vis-a-vis his Muslim co-citizens. So there's another example, the world's biggest democracy moving in a harder direction. Barbara's got a good point. Again, I'm not a religious guy, but maybe we got to go back to foundational myths. Foundational myth is, and it's exactly that. It portrays the birth of the nation and what happens afterwards in a light that reaffirms unity and commonality and those sort of things in its ideal form, regardless of race, religion, sexual preference. It's the commonalities. And for that to happen, we'd have to really start teaching civics in primary school. I can tell you that in this household with the 2 political scientists, my soon-to-be 10-year-old gets worked over regularly on very basic democratic theory. But I really think that if decision makers understand what we've been talking about, maybe they don't. Maybe I look at the campaigns that are running now for our national elections in October, and I'm like, they're clueless. That even we in New Zealand are stagnating. There's something wrong, and it's not as bad as other places, but they're not getting it. They're all opportunistic, and worse yet, the right wing in New Zealand's adopting American style approaches to politics. No good can come of that. But to the point, and in conclusion, it has to be uh, well reasoned national debates within mature as well as immature democracies about what they want to be. I mean, it may be that some societies, the majority want to be authoritarian, right? They're not liberal and they're not socialist. They want to be something else. But it's not, it's not inconceivable that that sort of debate would elicit a greater public support for democracy as an intrinsic value, in principle, if you will. And then we can discuss the details. Now, I just saw something run across the screen about foundational myth being a Leo Strauss concept. No, it is not. Bringing Strauss into this, Simon, I'm seeing what you're saying. You're just plain wrong. I was a student in Chicago of Leo Strauss's best protege. We all had to take his intro to theory course at the PhD level. A guy by the name of Joe Cropsey. Go look him up because you're talking about neoconservatives. Never once did either Strauss or Cropsey talk about foundational myths. What they wanted to talk about was the conservative movement and the revitalization of the conservative movement. And what they did do was give an intellectual wrapping around the neoliberal policies that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Roger Douglas were going to foist on the rest of us. So it gave this sort of social, I won't call it a veneer, but a societal political blanket. But it wasn't about foundational myths. Foundational myths are specific to every country. And again, they're myths, okay? They're not the truth. Look at the whole argument about critical race theory. All right, critical race theory is just telling it what it, like it is, and that offends people who bought into the white myth that everything U.S. was the house on the hill, and all that sort of stuff. What's interesting is the circumstances of New Zealand's birth as a modern society. New Zealand doesn't really have a foundational myth. We have the treaty, but we don't have this overarching story about how we came to be. And quite frankly, I think that it serves, I think it actually has served Maori well, because it hasn't been whitewashed. It was back when, but increasingly the reality of colonial rule has come to the fore. And so I think that it's necessary, but in a fair way. And that's where civics comes in. We agree, we'll disagree on certain interpretations, but these are the facts. And what makes us different, be it as Kiwis or as Yanks, or closer to my heart, as Argentines, what makes us different than everybody else? And I'll conclude with this. What makes Argentines different is that they're the world soccer champions, and Lionel Messi is now the mayor of Miami. So on that note, I'll let it go.
I'll let it go. Okay, thank you for that, Paul, and also for raising that, clarification with what Simon Hughes had raised there. And Simon, I'll just read out here. He says, okay, I'm happy to look into that, and I will be very happy to be corrected. So there you go. Good audience there. That's a very good one. And I'll just, as we wrap here, there's two comments that I've selected out here. Simon Hughes, once again, and he says, I would like to thank you both for doing this talk this week. It is a very important topic. I couldn't agree more. And Barbara Thomas says, thanks for the vote of thanks for New Zealand, Paul. That's relating to wanting to raise your child in this country as your preference. So people, thank you for your time. Thank you very much to the conversations that have been going on online, but on YouTube in particular. And I really appreciate that. It certainly brings a life and energy to the recordings of the podcast while we're live. We will be here once again in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, New Zealand time, around midday, and also that equates to around 8 p.m. in the United States Eastern time zone and the daylight saving band, and that's on a Wednesday evening. So we look forward to coming back with another stimulating set of topics and bringing once again some life into the podcast fraternity on such discourse and topics. Until that time, take care out there, and I hope it is a week or 2 weeks that is beneficial to you all and progressive, and also look forward to your company once again. Until that time, ka kite anō, and take care out there. Goodbye.